Donna. Want to thank Donna, all of the folks at First Pres and the equipped group of Salem Presbytery, along with our Peace and Justice and Hunger committees for gathering today. It's great to have every one of you. You all know that we are a Matthew 25 Presbytery, and today we are blessed to have the director of our Office of Public Witness, Jimmie Hawkins, with us. Jimmie, we feel like is a part of Salem because many of you know he interned at St. James Pres when J. Herbert Nelson was pastor there. He did work with, some of you remember Joe Flora, who was our campus minister at UNCG, not to mention that he and Donna Chase were classmates at Union PSCE many moons ago. And so we feel like Jimmie is our brother in so many ways. And we thank you, Jimmie, for your work on behalf of all of us in the church through the Office of Public Witness. And I just want to say that today, as we talk about refugee work, sadly, it couldn't be a more timely topic. And I think about the fact that Jesus and his family had to escape Herod and flee to Egypt. So in a real sense, Jesus was a refugee. And so today, as we think of Afghanistan and Ukraine and other parts of the world, we remember Matthew 25, where Jesus said, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. So Jimmie, thanks for being with us. Thanks and blessings to you and your staff.
Thank you, Frank. Would you like to open us up in prayer?
I'd be happy to. God, thank you. Thank you for the gift of this beautiful day. Thank you for the gift of life and the blessing of being together in your spirit. God, bless our Office of Public Witness and all of the staff and all of the work that they do on behalf of all of us. And so use us as your instruments, God, to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, and to welcome the stranger in your name. And all God's people said, amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Frank. And everything that you said is extremely true. I feel like a son of Salem Presbytery because, as you said, I was there on the campus of UNCG and at St. James Presbyterian Church and lived in Greensboro and just really have a real love for Salem Presbytery. It was just a wonderful time together. And one other additional bit of information is that we now have 2 advocacy offices. We have the Office of Public Witness in Washington, D.C., which deals with primarily with, public policy on the federal level, White House, State Department, and members of Congress. But we also merged with our UN office out of New York about 1.5 years ago. So we meet once a week to talk about the ways in which we can interact, but also the ways in which our individual ministries are going on. So we're the advocacy offices for the PCUSA, and please keep us in mind if you ever want to do any public policy. I'm not going to talk a lot because we really are going to be blessed today. Susan Craver was just a good, wonderful colleague of mine. Susan, let me make sure I get your title correctly. Works with most of our refugee resettlement issues. She's the Associate for Refugees and Asylum in Presbyterian Disaster Assistance. And Susan has just been so active. I mean, and you really, originally I also had this conversation, but just thought of Susan. She really can give you some very specific information about the work of the church, a strong partner with Church World Service that deals so much of Refugee Resettlement. And as you know, we are in a partnership on several endeavors, and Susan can talk more about this, but Massanetter Springs, that I know most of us have been to in Harrisonburg, Virginia, is housing Afghan refugees right now through a partnership with Church World Service. So I just want to share this quote that Susan made at the Together We Stand conference, which was sponsored by Church World Service and PDA and the PCUSA. And Susan said that every step of the way, when you cut back the number of people allowed to come in through the Refugee Resettlement Program, you undermine our capacity to receive them. We often have churches that want all of the answers before they do anything. And I am like, just do what you can. Just do something. It's inspiring every day. We talk about the challenges, but I must tell you, I have had more fun, more laughter, and I am constantly inspired by the people that I meet. And I wanted to share that because that's her nature. That's who she is. She's a very inspiring person. She's committed to the work that she does, and she does do it in a way to lift people up rather than saying, you know, you need to do this, blah, blah, blah. But so I'm excited to introduce my friend and colleague, Susan, to you today. Susan.
Thank you, Jimmie. What a welcome. It is great to be with you all. And, you know, as Jimmie said, we don't do any of this alone. We do everything in partnership. And fortunately, in your bounds, not only do we have our Presbyterian presence, but we do have Church World Service, who is one of our partners in doing refugee ministry. I did prepare a PowerPoint, and I thought I would use it. Some of the slides I'll just kind of go through rather quickly, but I think it helps me to remember to point out some things as well as just give us a little structure. But at any time, I'm happy to just stop and pull it down too. We're a small group, so I'm happy to keep it informal. Can everybody see that okay? Yeah, okay. So most people, when they think about, if I can get my mouse to work, there we go. We just talked about this partnership, right? That we are, our mission is to enable congregations, such as congregations here in the United States, and mission partners, our Reformed Church partners, ecumenical partners around the world, to witness to the healing love of Christ. And most people know, because of our name, that PDA is a ministry of relief and response to national and international disasters. But we also have a second mandate that's been passed down to us, and that is to aid refugees and displaced persons, including resettlement. So those are actually two mandates. The one is not on top of the other. In other words, sometimes it is a refugee emergency, like what we're witnessing right now with Ukraine. But refugee resettlement is a later response. It often is after the initial emergency is passed, and that's also within our mandate. We're going to talk a little bit about different terminology that's used to talk about refugees, but I also, a lot of that is because of legal definitions, but we're here as people of faith. And so I also ask us to recall that not only are the names that we use in media and the names that are used in legal definitions, but that we as people of faith see people as whole human beings. Often the terms that are used, such as detainees, really dehumanize people from who they are as whole people. Illegals, again, a term often used to describe whether somebody has a legal status or not. Alien, this is a term that we hear not only in our immigration laws. We actually have the Immigration and Nationality Act, which refers to people born elsewhere as aliens, but it also is a term used even in our sacred texts. And certainly since 2011, if not before, often refugees and immigrants are talked about as a threat to our national security. But we as people of faith are asked to see, in the midst of all the different terms and names that are thrown out there, that we are often talking about families, we're talking about refugees, we're talking about neighbors, and we're talking about sons and daughters. I'm going to start real big and then move down into the US and into the church. Here's some statistics of just the last 3 years when we talk about people forcibly displaced around the world. We're talking about some of the largest displacements since World War II. again, now you can see where the different words start to come out. We have refugees who are under the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, is the dark blue. The light blue band are refugees under UNRWA. That's an administration that was set up for Palestinian refugees. And so those are all refugees, but they have different UN organizations working with them. The largest portion of forcibly displaced people are actually internally displaced. That means they had to flee their home, their town, within their country, but they didn't actually cross international borders. And then we have asylum seekers, people who are literally on the move, like the Ukrainians right now. In many countries like the US, they have to have individual applications. And when the UN was putting together these numbers, they added a separate line to talk about the Venezuelans. The Venezuelans could, in reality, fit into all these different categories, but many countries welcomed them in the Americas under other statuses, to be students, to work. And so they don't have that refugee status, but they're really there because of that forced displacement. So we're a small enough group. I'm going to stop sharing a second to talk about that. We use that word refugee a lot, in just common everyday language. But in legal terms, it has a very specific definition that came out of our World War II experience. So since we're small enough, I took down the slides so you can't cheat. What do you know about what it means to be a refugee? What would have to be true for you to be a refugee? Can anybody be considered a refugee? Anybody on the move?
You have to be under threat of violence in your home country.
So you have to be under threat. The actual phrase is persecution. So violence is one of the ways. So you can be under threat of persecution due to violence. You can be under threat of persecution in terms of imprisonment. All right.
And it's not just family violence. It's not because your husband hits you or you have a bad life. It's a political thing.
That's really good, because one of the aspects about being a refugee is that the government of the country where you are either cannot or will not protect you from that. So you're right. It doesn't mean that the government has to be the one responsible for persecuting you. It could be you're at risk because of another group, right, that's in the country that's fighting or that's attacking people. But it has to be at the level which the government cannot or will not protect you from that. Yeah. So a lot of times there is that conversation. At what point does something rise to the level, or can you draw a line that shows? So I remember years ago, a Jordanian woman who was being attacked by family members because she was a Christian who married a Muslim. And in our culture, we would say that's a domestic violence issue. Why does she need to leave Jordan because of that? But in her history, she had actually gone to the police to seek protection, and they said, we will not protect you. The only thing we can do if you want is we'll put you in jail here and you can stay in jail. That was the offer of protection. So in that case, she was able to make a case because she had actually sought protection from her government, and they said, we will not, we cannot. Jimmie.
And Susan, do you have to cross an international border? Can you be a refugee within your own land? Your own country?
No, that's why we have that different phrase, internally displaced, because you actually have to be outside your country. So you can't be a refugee in your own country. We do sometimes, again, in the common language. I remember people talking about refugees from Katrina, but really you can't be a refugee inside your homeland. So whenever we talk about a refugee, you have to have crossed an international border. Right now with the Ukraine crisis, we have about the same number of people, a little more right now, that are refugees. In other words, they've actually crossed out of Ukraine into neighboring countries. And we have another couple million that are inside still Ukraine, and they cannot be refugees. The other aspect about that persecution is it doesn't have to be past persecution. It can actually be fear of. So, it doesn't mean we, in our, gallows humor, sometimes talk about the person that was killed would get refugee status, but you don't actually have to have been tortured. You can have a fear of being tortured, but it also has to be connected to one of 5 reasons. So it can't just be random reasons. And that's where the definition comes in, and I will put back up the screen. So the persecution has to be based on your race, your religion, your nationality, your political opinion, or membership in a social group. Now, membership in a social group is kind of a broader category, but that's where women often have gotten refugee status because of persecution of women, youth in some cases, student associations or university professors associations, workers alliances or unions, those kinds of things have all been used as part of being persecuted for a reason. So that's what makes it a little more complicated, because it can't be just generalized violence. You have to be able to tie your fear to one of those 5 reasons. I know you all asked to talk about resettlement, but I just want to say a couple words about, so we know refugees is because you're outside your country. Refugees come to the United States in many different ways, and one of the ways is also coming to our borders. We don't know, when there's a large flow of people, who in that mix are refugees and who are not, right? So there has to be a process for that. But we've had increasing numbers of people coming from Central America, as well as now coming from all over the world who have found their way up through Mexico to the US border. When a crisis emerges, like Afghanistan or Ukraine or many of the others around the world, we talk about there being short-term, immediate emergency, and then we talk about the long-term. So, you know, people fleeing Ukraine right now, it's just about getting them shelter, getting them food, getting them clothing, right? A safe place to be, and asking those governments, please keep your borders open so they can come across the border and find safety. Over the long term, we hope we can find peace back in their home country, and the vast majority of refugees want to go home. So we call that safe return. Not forced back, not deported back, not forced back when it's still unsafe, but when it is safe to go home, the majority want to go home. The second long-term solution is what we call settlement, and that is that you get to stay wherever you landed. So right now we have people that are given permission to stay temporarily, but that doesn't mean that they get the right to become a long-term resident there and to work, right? And all of those things. So settlement is the second solution. And the third solution is refugee resettlement. And that's where you've already fled your country to a second country, but instead of settling there, you're now moved to a third place, in this case, the United States. This is a complicated diagram, but I just wanted to show you, you are a refugee because of what happened to you in your home country. But how you're dealt with here in the United States varies a lot depending upon when you ask the government to recognize you as a refugee. And so the top line on this that has the letter A at it, that's the refugee resettlement that we'll talk about more. The second one is you came into the country maybe as a student, maybe as a visitor, and you apply to be recognized as a refugee after you come here. That's called asylum, and you make an application and you get interviewed by an official. The third one are the people that we described at the border, the people at the border, or even if you come through an airport, through an air flight into the airport. You didn't ask for asylum in the US, you didn't apply overseas, you're asking right at the border or right at the airport. We put those people into an immigration court process, very complicated court process, where they eventually get to ask for asylum, but it is much more difficult, and often they are put in detention while they're doing that. And then the last one we refer to as the defensive asylum process. That's you're in the US, you never asked anybody for protection. Maybe at the time you came, it wasn't an issue, right? Maybe you're a Ukrainian that's been living in the country for 5 years, nothing happened. Then something happens where you get in trouble. You have a car accident that you're at fault or some other thing, and you come before the courts and the court says, we're going to deport you. And you say, no, you can't deport me because I now want to tell you why I am afraid to go home. And I always leave that in because it's important for us to remember that the ability to ask for that help, for that protection is so important that our laws have thought about it coming up at any part of the system, any part of the system. And that means even at the point where you're about to be deported, if your life is at risk, you have the right to ask to not be deported. Just showing our land borders. One of the detention centers you might land in if you seek asylum at the border. This is a map of all the detention centers around the country. We have over 200 places. We are the largest. Our country is the largest immigrant detention system in the world. If you are released from detention, more often than not, now you have one of these ankle monitors put on you, and there is no rhyme or reason to how long that might be left on you. Now they're shifting with our smartphones to electronic monitoring from your phone, but a lot of people. Refugee resettlement. Of all the refugees in the world, less than 1% will ever be resettled. Less than 1%. So remember, I was saying that's just one of 3 solutions. The biggest solution is just to wait it out until you can go home. Refugee resettlement to the US is a really complicated process. And for most of our history, we have worked very closely with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, who are often the first responders. They're the ones setting up processes to recognize, identify refugees and welcome them. And they identify refugees and refer them to the US government. And then we go through a very long process of interviews overseas, of matching them with national organizations like Church World Service, who then in turn match them with local partners before they can ever come here. This is a map of the refugee resettlement sites around the country a couple of years ago. They haven't updated the map, but you can see a lot around, more on the east side of the country than the west, a lot around major cities and the coast, not as many offices in the middle of the country. And a few years ago, we did a survey where we asked Presbyterian churches where they were doing refugee ministry. And this is what came up of those churches. And you'll see a pretty similar pattern to the map that I showed you before. Now, in this case, we weren't quite as narrow as saying refugee resettlement, but I'm still not surprised to see that the vast majority are clustered around areas where there are also these refugee resettlement ministries. Every year, the president is to make a determination of a goal for how many refugees will be resettled every year. They call those refugee admissions. And then it's up to the government to work with these national partners to make it happen. So the blue line you see in this graph is that annual goal or ceiling. And the orange is how close we got to that every year. And those numbers you can't carry over from one year to the next. So if you look back in the early 2000s, you see a big dive down there. And I bet you all can tell me what happened that would make us stop refugee resettlement for a while in 2001. Anybody want to guess what happened in 2001?
9/11.
9/11.
That's right. So we absolutely stopped resettlement for months. And you can see how crooked the line is after that, because in stopping that, we had to stop all those processes overseas. We had to stop all the work over here. Staff got laid off, right? A lot of things happened. It took us a long time to get that built back up. here's just the last 3 years, so you can see the actual numbers better. So in 2019, we were under the previous government. They were intentionally lowering the goal every year. They set the ceiling at 30,000, which was the lowest we'd ever set it since 1980. And they did actually have enough people in the pipeline that they actually met the 30,000. So the goal was 30,000 and they met 30,000. Then the next year, the government cut the goal even more, down to 18,000. But that year we didn't even meet that. So we didn't even make it to 12,000. Then fiscal year 2021, which our fiscal years always start in October, it was initially set at 15,000. That was while we were still under President Trump. And when President Biden came into office, he reset the number at 62,500. But despite raising the goal, we didn't have the processes in place in order to make that happen. So even with that new target, we only admitted 11,411. Then there was a lot of pressure on him for this current year to raise it even more. And so he did. He raised the goal this year to 125,000. But as of the end of February, we'd only admitted 6,500. So that doesn't tell the whole story about what's going on with refugees, because what happened last year at the end of August?
Afghan refugees.
That's right. So the refugee resettlement continued to be very slow, all the overseas processes, but in the middle of that, we decided to evacuate. And so the US government, actually starting at the end of August, ended up evacuating 130,000 Afghans, of which almost 75,000 came into the US between the end of August and the end of last year. And we still have many more that are either on bases waiting to be moved out into the community, and that are in other places around the world, so that they're still part of that 130,000. And that doesn't even count Afghans who moved on their own, right? Who left on their own. So, so even as we were breaking down, the refugee resettlement network and the refugee resettlement capacity, all of a sudden, the Afghan refugee crisis hit. So those numbers are not shown within those official numbers, because that complex system was never in place for such a crisis like the Afghan evacuations. So now, let's see, a couple more things I just want to say, and then we're going to get into the advocacy part of all this. Sorry. So as I said, 130,000 evacuated from Afghanistan by the US government, 74,500 already admitted. They were admitted as, as parolees. We didn't have a way to admit them as, I'll pull those back up so you can, I want to make sure you have those links for later. They were brought in under what we call humanitarian parole, which is a temporary way. It was good in that we could do it very quickly. People were brought into military bases. They were processed. Many of them were already trying to seek visas to the US because of their work with US military and US government. So we had a lot of information on most of them. And so, but the refugee resettlement program was just too clunky for it. So they gave them humanitarian parole, and then they used the refugee resettlement network, so Church World Service and other organizations, to do the actual reception of receiving people once they came off the bases. But that's left us in a terrible dilemma, because that means that they have to renew that permission to stay here, or it's going to run out. If you come in as a refugee, you automatically are eligible to apply for a green card, which is a permanent residence. And within 5 years, you're eligible to apply for a citizen. But if you come in with a humanitarian parole, there's no pathway for you to go anywhere else. So one of the big advocacy asks we have right now is for what's called the Afghan Adjustment Act. And that would allow people who came in with that humanitarian parole to apply through the immigration processes to adjust, that's what we call it, adjust their status from parole to a green card. It still means they have to go fill out paperwork, but they don't have to go through the long process of asylum, which would be very complicated. It would be a lot easier for the refugees themselves. It would be a lot easier for the organizations that want to help them with the legal services, because we could set up a much more straightforward system. Instead of them having to prove that they are a refugee based on one of those 5 reasons, they would have to prove that they're Afghan, that they came through those evacuations, all of that that's very well documented, right? And of course, everybody, including before they ever were released with humanitarian parole, went through all sorts of security clearances. So the security clearances would be the same regardless. But the actual process would be much more straightforward. So we're actively asking people to advocate for the Afghan Adjustment Act. We had hopes of that getting included in one of the appropriations bills. It has not to this day. We've done that kind of thing before with other groups, but we have evacuated in other ways, or when we've used humanitarian parole in other emergencies. So there's plenty of precedent for that. So that's number 1 on our advocacy side. Number 2 is the refugee admissions numbers. As I said, every year the president has to set goals for the year. So every year we recommend people in August to really organize a visit with their members of Congress. And why with members of Congress? Well, because part of the refugee law says that the president has to consult with Congress before setting those goals. So Congress sets up a Q&A with them, and State Department usually is the one who presents it. And that is a wonderful opportunity to tell individual stories and to share about why we think it's important that more people get resettled. The last thing I will say on the, well, not last thing, but so one of the other things is June 20th is World Refugee Day. And many communities use that as an opportunity to kind of celebrate their diversity and lift up things. You know, they might have music festivals and food and all sorts of things like that, which is wonderful. But we've also found it's really a wonderful time to organize some of that kind of advocacy, to get people to make some statements about why it's important to welcome refugees into their community, to hear from the refugees themselves about family members who've been separated and who are waiting to be resettled. It's a great time to put out the word to people that we are going to organize some visits in August and come and be a part of those visits. The federal advocacy that we talk about is extremely important, but we also need the local voices. We also need local communities to be available and be aware and be in solidarity with that. So when I talk about advocacy, I always remind people that we have these specific federal laws that we need your advocacy on, but we also need you to be part of creating space in your community and solidarity in your community. And so, that means, who do you have that are civic leaders that people should hear from and who should be committed and saying, guess what, federal government, refugees are welcome here in my community. We stand with them and we welcome them. So that was a lot of information thrown at you. So I'm going to stop and just open it up for Q&A.
Go ahead and just.
Is there bipartisan support for the Afghan Adjustment Act, or is that split along party lines? And what would be the resistance to making this a smooth process to the green card?
There has been some bipartisan support, but not enough that they've been willing to introduce it as a standalone bill. So that's one of the challenges. We're not quite sure, other than just the overall narrative about not letting too many people in and some of those, we're not really sure what the resistance is. I actually thought it would be fairly straightforward. Congress did approve, for example, that people with humanitarian parole, the Afghans with humanitarian parole, would be eligible for refugee services. They did decide that last fall. So that was logical, right? That was what opened the door for the resettlement offices and for Health and Human Services to be able to provide services to the Afghans. So for me, it was pretty logical that the next step would be then to pass this Adjustment Act, but we have met resistance.
I don't want to dominate the conversation, but are you saying that the refugees that we are working with in Greensboro, North Carolina, and there are at least 2 groups represented on this call, that because those people cannot get a protected status, that they could be expatriated is the wrong term, but they could be rounded up and sent back to Afghanistan?
Technically, yes. They were, this is where our government acted faster than the policy could keep up. So they gave them this humanitarian parole. Some were only given 1 year. Most of them were given 2 years. And that was—
How do you find that out? How do you find out whether they're 1 year or 2 years?
They should all have documentation about that. And they're very worried, especially the ones with 1 year, because some of them already now been in the country 4 or 5 months. And the clock is ticking on them. So they will either have to go back and apply to get it extended, or they have to apply for other type of status. And some are filling out the paperwork to apply for asylum, which is a very complicated process and often requires you to present documentation that they don't have with them. If you had threats from the Taliban, you may not have that documentation with you because of the way the evacuation happened. So that would be a very complicated process, whereas this would be much easier. There would still be a fee. I'm sure there would be a fee involved for them to adjust status, but if not, they will eventually run out, right? So they eventually will be out of status here. They would become undocumented.
Jack, Church World Services has some legal help for them. And also there's a group called the Wilberforce Group working out of Janet Ward Black's office that will help them with legal issues, the legal issues around this particular thing.
Yeah, and so we're really hopeful that sooner, because people don't understand, the Afghans themselves don't understand their status, and it can be a lot of confusion. And if we run out of time, then it's just that much harder to get them back in the system. So we really want to get this passed as soon as possible. Karen?
So how does the numbers work? If the goal that was set by President Biden is 125,000, do the Afghans take up all of that and then there's nothing left for anybody else, or are they outside of that?
So there was proposals to include them in there, but they were not. So they're outside those numbers.
If they go back and apply to be refugees,
they'll still be outside those numbers because
they're still outside it.
Yeah. And the sad thing is that because the numbers were pulled back and there was so much resistance under the last administration, a lot of the people that were waiting overseas, some of them, have moved around. So there's a lot of challenges. The staff that were in contact with them in order to help them with their, applications and everything to the United States. So it's going to take a lot of rebuilding of this system. People have to be individually interviewed. So U.S. government has to get on a plane and go to where those refugees are and interview them. It's going to take a while to get that system back up. Yeah, Mary?
And thinking about that with the Afghanistans, what about the Ukrainians?
So the Ukrainians, are now moving into the region, right? So the resettlement is not something we would be doing in the short term. We have resettled Ukrainians even last year because there were people from the conflict that was ongoing before February 24th. But there are individual Ukrainians who, of course, have relationships here or whatever, who may be trying to come. But resettlement would be a much later stage. Right now, it's really helping people to be safe near Ukraine. Most of them want to be able to go back. They've left their husbands and brothers and sons.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
So what's your critique of the Biden administration? We know after the Trump administration drastically just basically cut all the numbers. So what's your feeling about the Biden administration? Because I've heard pro and con, you know, that obviously he's increased the numbers, but that not as much attention as one would have thought has been given to refugee resettlement.
Yeah, I think it's been frustrating for a lot of us in the immigration advocacy community, because there were a lot of statements made, even when Biden was running for election, about promises, and particularly concerned about some of the policies for the asylum seekers, people that are at our border, that are coming to the airports. That changes have not been as fast as we would have liked to have seen. It takes intentional investment. It takes thinking about different ways of approaching the work than we have in the past. He still gets slammed about having open borders, about all of these kinds of statements that are just not true. If you look, we've been holding people across the border. We've had lots of deaths of people waiting to get in because of being pushed back. But there's still this conversation around open borders, which I think he still fights against.
And if we're going to be honest, I mean, we have never really put on the congressional level, the energy into dealing with a path to citizenship, how to handle refugee resettlement. Even with Obama deported, you know, as many refugees, immigrants as any president. And then of course we had Trump and that fiasco, and then now the slowness of the Biden administration. Because didn't he reinstate Trump's policy that they have to be evaluated on the other side of the border? They can't even get into the US.
Yeah, so two policies that we've been fighting for a long time at the border. One is called Remain in Mexico, MPP. And that was saying, we're not going to let you stay in the US while you're waiting for your court. You actually have to go back to Mexico, and then we'll let you know when your court date comes up. And that went from that to then creating this kind of rapid court intense along the border. So people have been pushed back under that. We also have been pushing people back under a CDC title that talks about public health. And so they're using COVID to say that under public health, Title 42, we're going to push people back because they're a public health risk under the pandemic. Even though there's no provisions, and actually we've deported people who are actively infected. We've had deaths in the detention centers because of infections. So people feel that this is a ruse, this using the Title 42, that it really isn't honest. The CDC at one point even had some people kind of speak out against it. Now they've been quieted down. But both of those have created a false sense of the numbers at the border, because by pushing people just physically back, they then come back again. And so it makes it look like there's actually more people there than there are. Not to say there aren't people, but definitely it's adding to the sense of crisis.
And most of this policy would come from Homeland Security.
All of this is under the Department of Homeland Security. Much of it is being held very closely, however, within the White House. So West Wing staffers who are a more conservative bent around this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Susan.
All right, can I ask another one then?
Sure.
What about the people? I didn't know about the 5 things that you have to be persecuted based on your race or your religion, or what about the people in I don't know if it's Guatemala or Honduras or both, where there's just so much violence, gang violence in their country, and the government is not prosecuting the gangs because they're in bed with them, and those people are all trying to get out. That's not one of those 5 reasons. I mean, can those people request asylum because of that?
Yeah, and there's actually been a lot of good asylum law around that falling into those social group categories. And that goes back, I think, to the question, I guess it was Jack was making earlier. So domestic violence by itself would not be a ground. But if it's in the context of gangs and criminal elements who are controlling the region, and the mayor or the police are, are part of the whole system, which is what we have seen in Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador. Well, not less in El Salvador, but Honduras in particular, where they're all connected to each other. And so your ability to seek protection as an individual is lost because you actually have the organized crime and the local authorities working together. And there have been, that was certainly one of the areas that President Trump tried to undermine. He tried to make rules saying that those could not be considered grounds for asylum, but we have many years now of asylum history case law around both of those cases. So.
And related to that, what about ethnicity? So that's not a factor.
Yes, ethnic group is in the list along with race. So certainly in Guatemala, that's of course a big issue. A lot of the discrimination and persecution is around their indigenous group. And so people through the years have gotten asylum because of that.
Okay. Okay. Well, Susan, I'm going to ask you this: what factor does race play in denial of protective status in as far as the way we deal with refugees?
It plays a big part, Jimmie. Sadly, in all aspects of our immigration system, Black immigrants have a higher rate of detention than any other. They're detained longer than any other. They have higher bond rates if they are offered the opportunity to get bonded out of detention. On the refugee asylum, they face much higher burden of discrimination against whether or not they have an asylum claim. I think both race and poverty play a lot into it because those biases that we have. President Biden has now had more than 200 flights back to Haiti. 200 flights back to Haiti in the time that he's been in office. And so 200 deportation flights of people that never even got a chance to make an asylum claim. Assumption based on, larger problems in the country, but not even given the opportunity. And that's against both our law and international law to not give you that meaningful ability to at least make your claim. We've been advocating for several years for temporary protected status for Cameroonians. Temporary protected status, kind of like that parole thing. It's not a long term. They're often given for like 2 years at a time, and then you can apply to renew it. We've been asking that for Cameroonians. Our government recognizes that there's conflict in Cameroon, that people are at danger. I mean, we're involved in trying to do diplomatic, negotiations there. And yet at the same time, we're deporting people back to Cameroon. The Ukrainians got TPS already, and the conflict isn't even, well, what is it now? It's just 3 weeks old, and they've already gotten temporary protected status. And Cameroonians who've been in this country for years, we've been fighting for it, and they can't get it. So I sad to say, race plays a big role in this.
One of the things that it's hard, I think, for us to understand is that when somebody evacuates Haiti because there are earthquakes and there are hurricanes and other things that absolutely destroy their way of life and their way of getting by, that of itself does not give rise to any kind of special claim to come in this country, right?
Well, we did use TPS back with the earthquake back in 2000, was that 12? I'm losing track. No, 10.
What is CPS?
TPS, the temporary protected status, we
Yes,
have used it for
Uh-huh.
natural disasters. So we've used it when there's been, because one of the motivations for that is to say, you know, how is the country as a whole impacted? So there are Haitians here that were evacuated after the earthquake who were able to get that. But now we had a coup in Haiti. We had a coup. And yet that's not reason
Yeah.
to be able to get protection.
And Susan, would you also say that even in the examples that were given, they're never experienced outside of violence? Violence is always a part of, you know, you have immense poverty and then there's persecution that's going on as well. I mean, Haiti has always had been unstable politically. And so I think the violence is underplayed many times for it. They say, well, they're just trying to escape poverty, but violence is still an issue.
That's right. Violence is very much an issue. You know, I was on another nonprofit board where we had a Haitian person working with us, similar to a program like Living Waters, if you're familiar with that. And so, you know, he was going out into rural parts of Haiti and he had to stop doing it because his life was at risk. And so it's well documented that there's physical risk for people. But there's like a bias that permeates that.
What part do you think the private detention center industry plays in this issue of refugees or detainees and resistance to overhaul reform?
They're very big. We have two private firms that run prison systems here in the US. They're the largest private firms, imprisonment firms in the world. And they hire lobbyists. So they hire lobbyists to promote detention. They also had lobbyists who crafted legislation that promoted local cooperation between local police departments and immigration. Those were crafted by people paid by those corporations. So that's a big part. Studies have shown that the detention centers run by the for-profit actually treat the detainees worse, that conditions are worse than in the public prisons and jails. So it's really hard, but it's actually, I mean, they actually have hired, they've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars every year for lobbyists.
Do you feel like that's part of why the political will for immigration reform is being thwarted? Is that, I mean, I'm thinking, my brain's going to the advocacy piece right now.
Mm-hmm.
Am I competing for the ear of the members of Congress with the paid lobbyists for let's keep it like it is because we've got a great prison here, detention centers, so we can tend to this, you know, but we need a lot of people to make it work. So just keep the law. Anyway, that's my thing is that
Yes,
who
you
I'm
are,
competing against for advocacy?
Yes, that's definitely one of the groups you're working against. The other is that in a lot of places, our prisons have been built in pretty remote towns. And they're in the same community. There might be a state correctional facility, an immigration prison, might be a shared county, whatever, where that's become the dominant employer in that community. And so we've also run into local county and town officials saying, what else am I going to do to employ these people if we close this down? One of our partners called Detention Watch Network has a campaign called Communities Not Cages, saying you could invest that money in those communities instead of locking people up, and trying to be creative and thinking about alternative employment opportunities. What could people do in those towns if you displaced them? So it's both of those, the corporation and some of the employees.
Susan, this has been a rich time, a timely topic, and your expertise is encouraging to all of us to feel like we have ways to connect, to be a part of the solution to these issues. And I just want to thank you and Jimmie and everyone for being a part of this today. And I think we all recognize how this is a critical piece to being a Matthew 25 church and a Matthew 25 Presbytery, where we can get involved right now. So I know we all thank you all so much for your time and expertise and all that you've done. And Jimmie, would you mind closing us out with a word of prayer?
Yeah, be glad
Frank,
Yeah.
before we leave, how can we access this recording, Donna, for other people who haven't had a chance to?
I can send the recording out, Jack, after we finish, or tomorrow. I can do that. I can send it to the folks
Right.
on the call and or people that we sent the original Zoom link to.
Thank you.
Thank you.
to.
I'll just say real quickly, we're going to have a Bread for the World meeting at 3:00 on Zoom. If you're looking for another Zoom meeting, I would love to have you come join us. I put my email in the chat. So that'll be at 3:00. I'll be glad to send you the link. And I know Jimmie is on his way to another meeting, and probably Susan too. So Jimmie, close us out with prayer.
And again, I want to thank Donna and Frank for inviting us on behalf of the Presbytery. And Susan, really thank you for the information that you have shared today, because I think she is a wonderful resource for the church, and please continue to reach out to her. Let us pray. It's gracious God, we give you thanks for this opportunity to have this hard conversation. For we know that there are so many people around the world in desperate need of help, to live in a safe place without persecution, to be able to fulfill their God-given gifts and talents, to be able to work, to be able to raise their children in peace with a quality education. And we pray that you may continue to use people of faith, the Presbyterian Church in particular, to partner with agencies like Church World Service and other nonprofits, which are offering hope, which are offering resettlement opportunities, which are partnering with the government in order that the peace of Jesus Christ might be experienced by all people. Continue to bring us together, oh God, for conversation and for service. In Jesus Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Donna. Thanks for getting us together.
Thanks a lot. It was